Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Subscription Scaled. I'm your host, Nick Frederick. With me today is David Pinkus, who is the CTO of Pvolve. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Awesome to have you. Well, why don't you start at the beginning here? Tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and how you came to be at Pvolve.
Okay. I'm a longtime software nerd, starting from the Radio Shacks in the mall and going in and playing on a TRS.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I remember those.
I was a very, very small child, but I was always enthralled with technology and software. So studied computer science at Carnegie Mellon, and then had a career largely in Silicon Valley, working for Oracle, working for Google eventually, and a bunch of startups along the way too. So I think one of the more relevant, interesting things about the subscription world was at Google, I was in charge of parting the billing infrastructure, which is like, how do you collect money for your ad spend, your ad budget? And then how do you actually charge against that? That is an incredibly complex problem at scale. And so I've always been intrigued with, billing models and how to structure those systems effectively and quickly.
Wow, that is a big job. I'm sure you learned a lot of lessons there.
Indeed. In fact, you can't actually accrue for a click in real time. There's not enough compute power to do that. So you collect all the clicks, and then you work in the background to catch the clicks up with the budget you have spent, because you want the person to click on something and go as fast as possible to the site, right? So if I'm paying for an ad, I don't want you to do another calculation. I just want you to click and go. And so it was really interesting how to structure like a very scalable system to do that.
Wow, interesting. Is that not to go down this rabbit hole, but is that sometimes why the budget you set might sometimes go a little bit over?
100%. Because again, it's if you think about like a $100 budget, but like the clicks are sort of priced in real time, right? Depending on the competition and whatnot. So it's to decrement you from the 100, or if you're going down in the budget, that would just be too expensive a call, and you don't want a slow system. And in fact, if the system doesn't respond quickly enough, Google eats the cost and just sends you right away. Like performance is one of the key mandates there. And that's actually something I learned early in my career too. Is the three most important things for most applications are performance. Once you have it performing well, then you start to add a little fanciness and do other things. But users, especially today, there's very little tolerance for slowness, right? You have to have a really crisp, fast site.
Yeah, absolutely. The bar is high. Well, how did all of that lead you to where you are now?
So I had worked with one of the vendors that Pvolve was using. And so a few years ago, I got a phone call from one of the vendors I'd working with, and they said they're working with a really interesting company out of Manhattan, and they needed some help with some technology decisions and vendor management. And this vendor in particular was somebody I'd worked with for quite a few engagements, and we got along well. I liked the working style, and they liked the fact that I held them pretty accountable for things too, like in a very healthy, respectful way. And so they introduced me to the president of the company, and through an interview process, we eventually came to an agreement, and I joined. And it was a really interesting time. So it was just post-COVID. And obviously during COVID, there was this incredible surge of interest in fitness companies and opportunities. And we had equipment, which was great for COVID. And we had streaming, which was great for COVID. We also had physical studios, which were not great for COVID. So part of the business model just basically came to a grinding halt. And so we had to use those instructors as best as we could, and they would do classes from their home. And so, Pvolve has an omni-channel model. So there's physical studios, there's a live virtual experience, which is all based on Zoom. And then there's a streaming library of about 1,000 videos to consume, many of which are in a set or a series that's a prescribed order that we recommend you take it in. And so the live virtual experience actually turns out to be really, really important for people, because the instructors using Zoom can see your form. And so that corrective ability of an instructor during a session is really great. And so those became great. And then the instructors would do it from home, which was fine for everybody. Eventually, they returned back to a studio where they would do it again. And then the streaming stuff was either some of those videos, but mostly like pre-recorded, beautifully recorded, actually in a beautiful studio setting of different moves, functional fitness moves that would really resonate with people. And then there's a proprietary set of equipment that really enhanced the method too.
Wow. I've talked to a number of different fitness companies, none that actually were involved in all three of those
Right.
when COVID hit, right? So either they were, the gym or studio based, and then they saw this huge decline and were trying to figure out how to survive and get through, versus others that were, more on the streaming side. But it sounds like you guys were diversified. Has that continued to be the case, or are you focusing on one of those more than the other?
No, 100%. In fact, people now the trend is really boutique fitness, right? So, and if you drive by any strip mall in any city, or even just in neighborhoods, you'll find so many different permutations of fitness offerings, right? There's the boot camp crowd, there's the bar crowd, there's the yoga crowd, there's the Pilates crowd, there's the Pvolve type workouts, functional fitness crowds, there's CrossFit, there's strength training, there's just everything you can imagine, rowing, cycling, etc. And so boutique fitness is really the industry now, and people have sort of found their tribe. So we've continued to expand the physical locations because a lot of people want it, and that's being franchised out right now. So the corporate locations were New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and then the franchise locations are Carlsbad, San Diego, and many more opening up, Canada, Nashville, other places in the United States, et cetera.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay. So you came in, you said right post COVID. So the business existed
Correct.
prior to COVID. Okay.
Yes.
So you were coming in at a very interesting time. What happened with the business through that? You said you were repurposing some of the instructors to do more online, and then I assume had to transition back once people were able to and started coming back into the studios. Is that kind of how that evolution went?
So the studios opened up, and then we had a couple of waves of COVID, right? So sometimes you were masked. Depending on the city, California was much stricter, so those classes were going on masked. Yeah. There were capacity limitations. So we worked our way through the various COVID waves. And then it was time to really enhance and scale out the infrastructure and see if we were doing things correctly. And so this is actually a pretty complex subscription or business model. And so you have memberships in a physical studio, and that had been done with MindBody Online. That's probably the number one product used across studios or boutique fitness operations, in the country, certainly probably around the world. But then there were other products that were emerging that were better designed for franchise models. And so we were evaluating if that was the right way for us to do that. And then, within that system, you have a separate login and password, right? And then we had the streaming experience, which had its own login and password. One of the goals was, well, can we have a single one, like a single sign-on to connect it more easily? And then you also, if you're using Shopify, you have a Shopify account. So Shopify is this technology called Multipass, where you can have like a shared account between how you log into the membership experience and how you log into Shopify. And so we were trying to implement that to make it as smooth and streamlined as possible for our members. And we had an interesting challenge, which is that the software, the e-commerce platforms at the time didn't easily support the idea of buying a physical product and a digital subscription at the same time. And that's what we were offering, because we had these equipment bundles, and they were great. And were they necessary? Probably yes. Like you could do some free classes without it, or just even like paid classes without it, but you really needed the equipment to take advantage of the model. The functional fitness model is really thoughtful, really well designed. It was actually designed by a trainer who was training the Victoria's Secret models who wear the angel wings. And those are like 70 pounds. So you need to have like an incredible amount of core strength to walk down the aisle or walk down the runway, right? With these like heavy angel wings. And so people were really loving the methodology, but as part of that, there was the development of certain proprietary equipment. So including certain types of balls and bands and a slant board, and a variety of other things that really catered to the kind of functional movements that people needed to do. So in any case, we had this bundle of equipment offering, and the bundles also included membership. And so we were trying different permutations with that. One of the challenges with that, though, was the software, the commercial software wasn't really up to that challenge yet. And so we had to figure out how we could sell the membership and sell the equipment and check you out as seamlessly as possible, and then try to account for sales tax. And so that became actually like an incredibly expensive, complex things to do, right? So we had a custom checkout from Shopify using Stripe, but then the implementation of using Avalara or whatever other tax software you want to use for that downstream actually became pretty significant. So we eventually decided to try to move the entire checkout experience, including the purchase of the membership, back up into Shopify. So that required the exploration and use of other subscription products that could plug into Shopify. There were some of them that were emerging, certainly, like recharge payments is one of the most popular ones. That's great for physical goods subscriptions. It is less good for digital memberships for a few reasons that I mentioned, as we were chit-chatting earlier, one of which is like with a subscription box or products that you order, when I stop or pause or cancel my subscription, it's done that day, right? As long as the shipment isn't queued up, we're good. But with a digital membership, I'm still entitled for the period of my term, which for some people is 30 days, 15 days, whatever the next billing increment is. So those platforms weren't really designed well for that. Oh, and to throw something else interesting to this equation, we also had a supplement product that was genius. It actually has like all 9 amino acids in it, and it's really great for you. And we wanted to do a subscription model with that. But to try to bundle a physical subscription good and a digital membership in the same experience, the software commercially doesn't exist for that yet.
Right. Just mind blown. Right.
Exactly. And then like your portal, like where you go in to make changes, I want to skip a month or I want to do this. You can't put both of them in there because it's confusing to people and it doesn't align. Right. Yep. So yeah, that was the thing really, like, how do we decomplexify this entire infrastructure and permutation? And what are the trade-offs? Because the more complex you try to be, the more expensive it is to develop it and maintain it. And at some point, you try to make it as convenient as possible, but the cost of that convenience may eclipse the value of that convenience. And that's the trade-off I think a lot of businesses need to reconcile.
Yeah, that's always a tough decision, though. And we work with merchants and have absolutely been in similar scenarios where you're like, okay, what you're trying to do here, and your example is perfect, makes all the sense in the world from a user experience perspective. Here's all that's going to be affected in the background to make that happen. Is this trade-off actually worth it? And a lot of times you're talking to product people who are like, yeah, it's absolutely worth it. Let's go. Let's make this happen. But that really isn't always the best business decision, is it?
No, often it isn't. And, I often say that all code is a liability. And for a lot of people, they initially have a visceral response. It's like, wait a minute, like, am I a liability? Am I not worth it here? And I don't mean that at all. I mean that like every line of code you write, you have to design, you have to debug, you have to write tests for, you have to do a lot of things to maintain it, support it, document it, et cetera. And so you've got to be really, really judicious about what you choose to write and what you choose to not write. So, for example, we wanted to have a single sign-on experience, right? You create this omni-channel ID and you log into our streaming experience, and then you can go and schedule your live virtual experience. And we used a scheduling package to do that. And that scheduling package was the same scheduling package as the studios use. They had their own separate IDs. So they said, sure, we can support you guys providing the login and authentication information to us. The problem is they had never done that with what we were using. So we were customer number one with that. And it just honestly became more complex than it was worth and more expensive than it was worth at the end of the day. It's working down the road. It's fine. Debugging it is hard. And if there's a glitch, since they've only done it for us, it isn't necessarily the highest priority for them to get to right away, right? When they have hundreds and hundreds of other studios. So that's sort of another cautionary thing is like vendors will promise you the world. Don't ever be version or customer number 1 or even 2 or up to 10 with them. Like you want to be somebody that they've already done implementations for many, many, many times.
Yeah, that's actually a good transition and a little bit into that build versus buy discussion. What's the criteria for you? You've probably been down this path hundreds of times when thinking through, okay, we have enough unique requirements that we can go off and build this thing. You can build anything, right? Versus go buy something off of the shelf that meets 95% of our requirements. We can figure out the remaining 5%. Like what goes into those decisions for you?
The cost of the vertical slice. So the vertical slice, if you think about a 7-layer dip, right, at a party, and you're going to put the sour cream in there and the beans and the cheese and the guac and everything else. You don't want to just taste the one layer, right? That layer can be great and perfect and wonderful. And ground beef is like, it's perfect, right? You really want to taste everything at once. You need to make sure that every single layer works and pairs with each other well. Sort of like the cooking shows where they have that like one bite contest where you have to make the dish, but it's like one spoonful. And even when you're making, a cake or something else, like you want to make sure everything works together. And so one of the most important and valuable things you can do is before you start thinking about UI, right? Like, sure, you can make most things look really pretty. Just take the out of the box experience and see if what you're trying to do is actually feasible and viable using the products that the vendors have promised or claimed can do that, right? So before you like add all of your products to it, before you do all the beautiful artwork, everything else, make sure that the Shopify instance you're doing with, recharge or whatever else, the recurring subscription model is going to work, and see what it looks like. And every time you add another variable to that, you actually double the amount of testing permutations. So if you want to add a free trial to it, well, that means you have to test things with a free trial, without a free trial. If your free trial is 15 days or 30 days, you just double that again. If it's, every single way you can come into it. Oh, if you're checking out with credit card or PayPal, you've also doubled the amount of permutations you have to test. So take your vertical slice, make sure every layer of that stack works, identify which doesn't and how much it's going to cost to do that, and then make a decision. Because you don't want to get like 5 layers into your 7-layer dip and then find out there's an avocado shortage, right? And avocados are like $18 an avocado. Like you don't want to do that, right? So you really want to make sure you can do everything. It's affordable. You know how it's going to work. You can test it. You can support it, and then you can start to build out from there. And I've seen over and over and over again in like every single software company and department I've been in. And if you try to accelerate that, and if you try to get like too hyper focused on the look and feel of everything, and you forsake these problems, just say, oh, that's a later problem, you're going to find out it's a much, much bigger problem than you anticipated. And you would have been better off figuring that stuff out initially. It's sort of like, scientists, they want to just make sure that base science is actually viable before you build a product out of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, how do you account for the fact that I can solve for the requirements that are in front of me today, but I don't exactly know, no one really knows where my business is going, where we're going to operate, what products we're going to offer, what, countries we're going to want to expand into. How do you take enough of that into account so that when you're making those decisions, you're not just, again, solving for now, you're solving for later too, or at least prepared to solve later?
That's a great problem. And so as long as your technology works in one specific region and does that particularly well, part of the evaluation criteria for the vendors you're using is seeing, okay, am I going to be the first customer trying to expand into Canada or Mexico, or am I the 18th customer doing that, right? And so that's the criteria. You want to make sure that the vendors you're using are again, you're not too early as a super early adopter. You want to be an early-ish innovator, but you don't want to be like the bleeding edge of a technology unless you're a software company. But very few of these subscription businesses are software companies. Sure, the pure play Salesforce and other companies, that's pure software, fine. But if you're a fitness company, if you're a boxed product company, if you're a micro puzzle company, if you're flowers, if whatever you are, you're not a software company, right? We're not a software company. We're a fitness company, right? We're a functional fitness company with studios and a streaming library. And so the spend should be very heavily towards the actual deliverable of the value. And you should spend, frankly, as little as necessary on the e-commerce infrastructure. Sure, you can tweak it a little bit, but that's not your core competency. And companies get themselves in trouble when they try to be experts in something and they lose track of what they're legitimately experts in and where the growth opportunities are.
Yeah. Well, that's not, I love that perspective. I share it. I don't necessarily hear that from a lot of CTOs, or just at least not openly, right? They're like, hey, there's a nail, I've got a hammer, let's drive it in, right? Instead of, taking a step back and thinking about what's our actual business problem here, and where do we differentiate ourselves, focus, like you said, on the product, the fitness itself, and spend as little as possible on the technology. Have you found that to be true throughout the industry or different companies that you've worked in?
I think it depends, honestly, on the level of maturity of the technology team. Like, software is fun. Like, a lot of people got into software because you can completely control something, right? I have a requirement. I can make the software do exactly what I want. That is addicting, and it's incredible, and it's fun, energizing. It's delicious, frankly. And so you get addicted to that. And there is some truth in the fact that like you can make software do anything, right? But the other part of that is the cost necessary to complete that. And then the maturity to say, I don't think that's in the best interest of the business, right? So at the CXO level, you have to be responsible fiduciary to the company, right? You have to spend the money as wisely as possible. And while building software is fun, and you may really like the product or the project, You can't do that. You have to think of the company as a whole and imagine it's your money that's being invested into the company.
Yeah. Yeah. How do you disseminate that philosophy throughout a technology team? Because I think there's others that share it, but getting all of your engineers, your architects, to kind of adopt that and use that framework when they're thinking about how to solve problems, it is hard, right? Especially the further they get away from control of the actual budget.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So one of the most important things in a working engineering organization or even any company is a high level of trust with your team. So Google published a lot of the work on their Project Oxygen, which is what does it take for the best performing teams to perform at their peak in an organization? And one of the key things is a very high level of emotional safety with your peers. And so having that kind of honest conversation with everybody where they trust you and you trust them is one of the most necessary things to have that kind of relationship with people. And then you can usually logically talk about the pros and cons of each approach and how long things are going to take. And if you still get a tremendous amount of pushback, say, okay, well, let's try an experiment. Let's build this small little widget, this small thing, and see how long it took. And invariably, you'll find that things take longer than expected, and they take longer to test and longer to debug. Right, of course. And so that's why one of the most critical quintessential things is to break everything down into as small a project as possible, and then identify and manage that project really well, and then use the metrics you gain from that to figure out what the rest of the project is going to look like. So if the estimate was a month and it took 2.5 months, the next estimate you get of 2 months may take 5 months, right?
Yeah.
And so that's the whole promise of Agile is you do these like 2-week or 1-week sprints, and you really gauge the velocity of the team and how much they sandbag their estimates or like overestimate, like the Superman complex, right? Like I can get it done, get it done. But you also don't want people like working through every weekend because they burn themselves out. And then invariably you write code that has more bugs. And so there's a great study about the first Macintosh, and the team at Apple, they were proud of the fact they worked 90-hour weeks to get the first Macintosh out. But then a lot of people went back and studied the entire process. And they said if they would have worked 40-hour weeks, they would have released it a year earlier. Because they were reworking so many things. And we as human beings, you need to sleep and rest and recover. Like I spent a bunch of time in learning science, and you actually can't potentiate memories if you don't sleep. That's when the brain does its work to build the synaptic connections to make sure that you actually learn something that day. And if you're sleep deprived in perpetuity, you just won't learn. And so you'll keep making mistakes. And everybody knows, like they stay up late to write code, and then the next morning they sleep on it and they're like, oh yeah, I should have done it this way. And they go back and they fix it.
Right.
So you just have to have like a sustained velocity, a very high level of trust. I talk about people, strategy, process as the right order to approach things. And developing the people relationships and working with smart people and trusting them and them trusting you and building that great working relationship means you can do almost anything, right? Then the strategy's got to make sense, right? The business model has to make sense, because if it doesn't, then the processes won't matter, right? So you can do the processes late, but it doesn't matter how efficiently you're doing the wrong thing, right? You have to be doing the right thing. And so that's the order necessary. I've just seen that over and over again. And like if you have a great relationship with the people you're working with, then when you need them in a jam, they'll help you. So like very recently we had an issue overnight, and I texted one of the developers and I said, hey, would you mind taking a look at this, please? And he was like, sure, no problem. And so he fixed it like, 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning. It was just one of those weird things. And I was really grateful the next day. And he said, for a boss like you, I don't mind working late. That felt good, right? Because I trust him, I respect him. When I went out to New York to see him, we go out for drinks. We just, we have the person-to-person relationship at the end of the day is so critical. That's one of the reasons, like, I never call engineers resources. I don't call people resources, because resources are things like ore and wheat, things you mine in Minecraft, right? Or Settlers of Catan. Engineers are people. They're humans. And people have kids and they have lives and they have other needs, right? And so you need to be sensitive to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, what are some of the ways, since we're on this thread, that little tips and tricks you can do to build trust with your team, or to get them to trust you, especially in this world where probably a lot of your developers and your team are remote, right? Might be in different time zones or different parts of the country. And so that kind of personal walk by, the desk or water cooler conversations aren't what they used to be. So how are you doing that now?
So great question. There are actually, believe it or not, like Zoom tools to do that, where you can like play games with people and get to know each other. I think one of the ways you demonstrate your interest in somebody is your willingness to learn about them. And so take the time to chat with them, like learn about their career, learn about their aspirations, learn about their hobbies, and kind of humanize the relationship. That's one of the hardest things in this extremely virtual world is you don't get the time to just sit and schmooze, right? So I actually did make it a point to travel quite a bit. I've been to all the studios. Even if I was like on a personal trip, I would still stop by and I'd visit people in the area, visit people in the office. I was on a personal vacation in Argentina, and I took time out of my family vacation to meet with my team in Argentina because it was really important to me. And it was really great and really wonderful. And, again, these are people you talk to on Zoom, for 2 years, but to see them in person and hug them, it really helps a lot and goes a long way. And you want them to know that you're a human too, right? Like I take work seriously. I don't take myself too seriously. So I like joking with people. I like, establishing the fact that we're just people. We have kids, we have struggles, we have aspirations. And, at the end of the day, many of us just want to feel heard and be heard and do great work. There was a book a while ago about, wasn't Dan Ariely. It was another prominent economist. What does it take for knowledge workers to perform really well, right? Dan Pink. So Dan Pink did this research. Like, what does it take for a knowledge worker to perform well? And they want autonomy, mastery, sense of purpose. So autonomy is a function of the trustworthiness you can build with each other, right? So I trust you to be autonomous. I'm offering you that first, which means I trust you instinctually. And people usually rise up to that, right? Mastery is working on your craft. So giving them a product or project or technology that they can get really good at, and acknowledging and rewarding them for that, and requiring even tech talks, right? So, hey, you did some new technology. I want you this month to be the speaker in the department meeting where you explain what you did. And that causes people to actually even learn it better because they don't want to ask a question they don't know of. And then the last thing, sense of purpose, is how can I, how is what I'm doing matter, right? How does what I'm building matter to me, to the rest of the world, right? Nobody wants to work on something that's going to be thrown away. I've seen that actually at some points in my career, like developers who worked on something for 6 months and then the project was killed and they were deflated. They were like really, because they had this like personal sense of ownership, and it was like an affront to them. And yes, they could get over it, but like the most important thing the manager needed to do was to make sure that the next thing they worked on really mattered, was shipping, was going to get shipped, and they could own that.
Yeah. That can be tough to do though, right? Because you don't always know that a project's going to get killed, or I hope you don't know that it's going to get killed, and you can't make promises about the next one either, right? So that can be challenging, but I think to your point, treating them like humans, understanding where they're at and what they might be feeling about what they've been through, just kind of acknowledging that can probably go a long way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And shipping software feels really great when you could show your mom, hey, look at this app, look at this website. See that I did that, mom.
Yeah.
It feels really good. It goes a long way. And so you definitely want to like ship early and often as well.
Yeah. All right, let's go back to the Pvolve business for a second. So through COVID, we've talked about that. What are the various channels and ways that you guys are acquiring new customers today? You talked about there being a lot of different boutiques popping up, different types of fitness that consumers are interested in. Is functional fitness now at the point where it's kind of selling itself, or are you guys still having to do a lot of marketing and education to find new members?
That is a great question. Exactly. Nobody is Googling functional fitness workout.
Okay.
Right? So it was very, very hard to find customers. And we tried a lot of things. We tried buying traffic. It is extremely expensive to buy fitness related keywords because that competition is fierce. And if you've seen the YouTube influencers and everything else, like they always want to sell you a PDF for a program. And if the cost of their program is whatever, $20, they can still pay $15 to acquire you. So, a lot of these things get bid up really high. And it's really expensive to compete with them. So, we tried the search engine stuff. You have to do that. We tried a lot of Facebook ads. Those have different levels of success and you have to experiment like crazy. So we actually have a great data team. And their whole model is like, let's try this experiment. Let's get to stat sig on it and see which ad is working better, and then tweak it, and then lather, rinse, repeat. You have to be willing to do that. You can't be so committed to a specific marketing campaign or specific messaging. You just have to keep trying different things, experimenting, and see what's going to resonate with the market, especially if it's something new. Like if there's nothing to compare it to, people are really unsure what to do.
Yeah.
And so we did a lot of permutations there. We tried a lot of influencers as well. Word of mouth was great because, once people are into it, they really, really, really love it. But that also is hard as well too, because you're still trying to convince somebody to do it. We tried programs like Bringing a Friend, but that's kind of impractical with the equipment component to it, right? So we actually had an amazing opportunity, which not a lot of companies are going to get. But if somehow you do, this is really when you've got to like buckle down. And maybe the lesson is, if you make a really, really great product, somebody important, popular may want to be part of it, right? They'll use it and they may want to be part of it. So during the pandemic, Jennifer Aniston's assistant was doing Pvolve. And one day she went in to see Jen, and Jen said, "Wow, you look great. What are you doing?" And she said, "It's this thing called Pvolve." And so Jennifer subscribed. She became a secret streamer and got all the equipment and set up a studio at home and really, really, really started loving it. And then she reached out to us and she said she wanted to be part of it. And so, that's life-changing, frankly, right? Your customer acquisition cost goes from here to here. And that kind of endorsement is what we needed. We needed somebody to get us over the threshold of uncertainty about whether or not I can buy this. And, her level of renown and trust worldwide is almost unprecedented. There are very, very, very few people that are in that super, super A-list level. And so that's helped enormously. It was also really interesting, just the behind the scenes process of signing the contracts and whatnot, and how long that takes, and usage rights and things like that. And then preparing for it, right? So you got to load test everything, and your load capability is only as good as what you've tested for. And so if you haven't tested it, I don't believe it. And so, and people know that about me, right? I afford them trust and faith and test. So, Ronald Reagan said, "Trust but verify." And so when it comes to load, and, everybody is on board with that as well, too, because we've all seen, issues and permutations with software glitches. So we had to load test extremely high levels of traffic. One of the challenges with that is contractually, you can't load test Shopify. They forbid you from running a load test against their environment. And so, and some of our other vendors also contractually forbade us from load testing. Other ones were fine. Like Amazon is fine. I'm charging you for every cycle.
Right.
Load test all you want, right? Yeah. Although you still have to give them a heads up so they don't think it's a denial of service attack. So we had to build a lot of infrastructure to do that. But, getting back, so that endorsement was really, kind of an incredible thing. Is this a replicable model? Probably not. I mean, Ryan Reynolds with Aviation Gin, when people were thinking about gin before, there was Beefeater and Tanqueray, and those were the only things people ever thought of. And then suddenly he comes in, buys the company, endorses it, and now that's what everybody wants to drink. That's the 1% of the 1% of the 1% have a celebrity endorsement. Otherwise, you really have to figure out which of the marketing channels is going to work. The old cliche was 50% of your marketing budget is wasted. You just don't know which 50%.
Don't know which one.
So yeah, exactly. So, that's where being data-driven and willing to experiment and instrumenting the heck out of everything, and the software you can implement on your site that does the screen recording of people's paths and where they're clicking, like the heat maps and whatnot, that stuff is really valuable. It also got a little tricky though, because there are some lawsuits working their way through that's wiretapping. And so I believe most of the time it's been found that that's okay to use, but we still disclaimed it because you don't want to get on the radar of, class action suit. So any business owner that wants to use Full Story or Hotjar or anything like that, just check with a legal advisor, see what you should do, how you should disclaim it. A lot of times the cookie banners at the bottom that come up right away, they'll also have language about that, so you can get that acceptance. That's the other thing too, is as you're going internationally, there are lots of other things you have to be mindful of. And, one of the more interesting things too, and I know I'm getting a little bit off the marketing here, but when you're in the App Store, if you let your user create an account, Apple requires you to have them be able to delete that account. And GDPR requires that too, the right to be forgotten. And so you have to work with your engineering team to have the ability to anonymize records that you've collected. And so I say anonymize and not delete, because deleting is risky and scary and problematic, and it can actually distort historical data. You don't want to do that. And the courts are fine with this. Just turn my name, David Pinkus, into deleted user one, and then boom, and then you can do that. But you have to make sure your system can do that and support that.
Yeah, that's a very tricky, very slippery slope, right? Because I remember those days of right to be forgotten and how are we going to solve for this? And the initial, legal's like, I don't care, just delete it. And you're like, wait a minute, finance department over here needs to audit our records because, they need to be able to audit our revenue. I can't say a user that never existed. That sounds like you're making up revenue. So you had all these different departments kind of fighting with each other about what was the right strategy to forget a customer. And I've seen a lot of different companies take different paths on that one.
Yeah, that's one of the most important reasons why you can never use their email address as a key in any of the tables. Like that should exist in one place and one place only, and that is assigned to a number, and that's the key everywhere else in your system. One other thing that's part of that too is you need to be able to have a good demo or test user strategy, because you don't want to go in and have test transactions and then have to clean up your books later. You want to be able to like nip that early on. And everybody's doing live testing in prod anyway. Like after you do a major release, you just want to have a few transactions that go through production. And so you need a system for being able to delete those transactions before they get downstream. I used to work for the Apollo Group, which was the parent of 4 or 5 universities, one of which was the University of Phoenix. And at one point, we had sent somebody to collections, and that person's name was I'm a Test. And they didn't understand that was a test user. And the phone number was like one of the developers on the floor. And so
that's awesome.
Yeah. It was awesome, except they actually like write it off. Like they had to like figure out, how do we account for this nonsense? Because it was like an uncollectible debt.
Yeah. Too funny.
Yeah.
Okay. So you talked about it through all of that load testing. You got the ultimate influencer in the world with Jen Aniston, which, by the way, how cool was it that, you didn't, it wasn't just a business investment for her. Like she was a user first, right? Like she came to this, she saw it, she experienced it, and was like, this is something I want to get involved in. So what happened once all of that launched, and how has it changed the business?
So that's a great point you made. It was hugely validating, and nobody would argue that she looks incredible. She's like, over 50. She looks incredible. She works all the time. She loves the methodology, and her endorsement has been tremendous and huge. It's really transformed everything in the business. It's actually made us up our own game to a level of professionalism across the board too. Mm-hmm. So, when you might have been more forgiving of a certain bug or mistake or things like that, but your attention to detail and your polish has to really, really, really be top notch, because you have to imagine you on the phone with her demoing the product to her, or like her calling you, and she hasn't called me, but like her having a question about it. And you want to eliminate as much ambiguity in the experience as possible. Ambiguity causes a stress response with people. So you don't want any uncertainty. You want people to be really comfortable, really happy using your product. You want it to be polished. This is another part of social science. Actually, just broadly about me, like I think software engineering is equal parts computer science and social science. And if you just only focus on the comp side, you're going to miss a lot of really important things. So there's a notion in social science called a prediction violation. And what happens is your brain is used to taking a lot of information and trying to discard as much of it as possible because it's too much. And so your brain is used to looking for patterns in what you see around you, right? So in that patterns are safe. That's generally the heuristic the brain comes up with. So like, if I'm walking through the forest, I see a lot of green stuff, everything's pretty good. I see a flash of orange and I'm like, uh-oh, that could be a tiger, right? So your brain is like super, super high tuned to a prediction violation, it's called. Mm-hmm. The same is true with a lack of symmetry on a site, or an egregious spelling error, or like a space before a period. It's still a subtle prediction violation. It still causes a subtle adrenaline response. And so that kind of attention to detail when you're shipping really, really matters. And, from an evolutionary perspective, symmetry is really, really critical too. Like babies are much more drawn to symmetrical faces. And in fact, that's one of the metrics of beauty is how symmetrical you are. And because if you think evolutionarily, too much asymmetry might have meant something not healthy, right? Something was wrong on one side or the other. So it's really important that the aesthetics of the site look good. Now, again, you should do the full slice first, right? A sliceable experience, make sure the tech works, and then you can make it pretty. But when you have somebody like a Jen or somebody, a big influencer or a big market, again, you want a good attention to detail with what you're shipping. And in fact, it's better to ship less and make it great than it is to ship more where there are more imperfections.
Yeah, absolutely. So what's next for you guys? I mean, obviously you're riding this wave right now. Is it international expansion? I think you mentioned opening up franchise locations in the US. Is that kind of the focus for the next couple of years?
Franchise expansion is really one of the most strategically important things for us to do. And there's only so many you can open up both from an internal scale perspective and then from a training perspective, right? So it's not like you can just train everybody at once. Like you only have a certain number of trainers who are good, experienced trainers, and they can train a certain number of people. And then that group, progresses and promotes to the ability to train more people. So there's like somewhat of an artificial limit there, or natural limit, whatever, like, year by year, but that's going to expand, and that can eventually expand exponentially. Internationally, we're already in Canada. Looking at the UK, we've actually had a really good market there. And Australia, the shipping costs have really been problematic. So we've been trying to figure out how do we get a local warehouse or distributor or somebody over there, because some of our equipment is really heavy. Like we're shipping weights, and we probably need to come up with a package that doesn't include the weights and just have you get the weights locally. But we do have our slant board, which is made of bamboo, which is light-ish, but it's still heavy, right? And so that's where, and people are willing to pay it. But then there's also the shipping duties. And so that's a whole other thing to figure out with Shopify is like, do you pay the duties? They pay it when they receive it. If it's not clear and then it arrives in the country and then they have to pay even more money to pick it up, sometimes they say, no, it's not worth it. And then the receiving shipper just destroys it because it's too expensive to ship it back. So that's again, it's part of the slice. It's like, okay, let's say I want to expand it to the EU. How exactly do I do this? From the shipping perspective, the returns perspective, the taxable perspective, everything else, just a lot to do. So eventually, for sure, but there's enough expansion domestically for a while, and Canada too.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, look forward to you guys opening up a studio here in Nashville where I am.
Oh yeah, you're right. It's coming soon. I think by the end of the year. Yeah. Awesome.
Very cool. Well, David, this has been a lot of fun. If listeners today want to learn more about Pvolve, or maybe have some questions for you about some things that we talked about today, where are the best places for them to reach out?
pvolve.com, pvolve.com. And you can just reach out to my personal email, david@pinkus.com. So it's my name, david@pinkus.com.
Awesome. Well, David, again, appreciate you taking the time to come and share your insights and what you've learned along the way with us today. It's been very valuable. And thanks again for making the time.
Thanks, Nick. My pleasure. Take care.